Who is Jesus? My friends, let me ask you a question that has echoed through the ages, a question that demands an answer, a question that will shape your destiny. Who is He? Some say He was just a teacher, others call Him a prophet, some dismiss Him as a myth, but I tell you today He is more than a story, more than a man, more than history can contain. From the beginning of time He was there. Before the foundations of the earth were laid, He existed. He spoke the universe into motion. He breathed life into dust, and He holds all things together by His power. He came not with an army, not with wealth, not with power as men define it, but with something far greater, authority. When He spoke, storms ceased. When He commanded, demons fled. When He touched, the sick were healed. And when He called, the dead rose. He was love in human form, not the kind of love the world gives, temporary, selfish, conditional, but a love that never fails, never fades, never gives up. A love that saw the broken and restored them, that saw the outcast and embraced them, that saw the sinner and forgave them. But the world could not understand Him. The religious leaders despised Him, the powerful feared Him, and so they conspired, they accused, they betrayed, and they crucified Him. They thought they had silenced Him forever. But they did not know that when they laid Him in that tomb, He was not defeated. When they sealed that grave, they were not victorious, because on the third day, oh my friends, on the third day, the stone was rolled away and death itself was defeated. He is alive, and because He lives, you can have hope. Because He lives, you can have peace. Because He lives, you can have eternal life. So I ask you again, who is He to you? Is He just a name, just a story, or is He your Savior, your Redeemer, your King? Because, my friends, the truth is undeniable. He is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through Him. So the choice is yours. Will you reject Him, or will you receive Him? Because one day every knee will bow, every tongue will confess the truth. The question is, will you do it now, while grace is calling, or later, when time has run out? Who is He? He is the one who holds your eternity in His hands, and He is calling you today. Jesus is more than a man. He is not just a teacher, prophet, or historical figure. He existed before time, created the universe, and holds all things together by His power. Jesus demonstrated divine authority. He commanded nature, cast out demons, healed the sick, and even raised the dead, proving that He was more than human. Jesus embodied perfect love. His love was unconditional, restoring the broken, embracing the outcast, and offering forgiveness to sinners. Jesus conquered death. Though crucified and buried, He rose on the third day, defeating death and securing eternal life for those who believe in Him. Jesus demands a personal response. Everyone must answer the question, who is He to you? Will you reject Him, or will you receive Him as Lord and Savior? From the beginning of time, before the first breath of man, before the foundations of the world were laid, He existed, not as an idea, not as a creation, but as the very essence of existence itself. The universe did not bring Him forth, He brought forth the universe. He was not formed by time, He formed time itself. The stars in their brilliance, the oceans in their vastness, the mountains in their majesty, all testify of a presence beyond human comprehension. Yet when He stepped into history, He clothed Himself in flesh and walked among us, not as a ruler demanding allegiance, but as a servant demonstrating love. To the world He appeared as just a man. He walked on dusty roads, He grew hungry, He grew tired, He wept, He laughed, He embraced, and He suffered. He felt the weight of sorrow, the sting of betrayal, the exhaustion of labor. He lived among the poor, dined with sinners, and spoke to the outcasts. And yet, beneath that humble appearance, Behind those human eyes was the fullness of divinity itself. When he spoke, the heavens listened. When he commanded, creation obeyed. When he touched, the broken were restored. He was not limited by nature, he ruled over it. He was not bound by time, he existed beyond it. He was not subject to death, he had authority over it. The world could not comprehend him. The religious leaders feared him because he did not fit within their traditions. The scholars were baffled by him because his wisdom did not come from books but from eternity itself. The rulers were threatened by him because his power did not come from armies but from the very throne of heaven. Everywhere he went, people were divided. Some followed him, others despised him, but no one could ignore him. He spoke not as a man pondering truth, but as truth itself. He did not offer opinions, he declared absolutes. He did not suggest a way, he was the way. He did not point to life, he was life. The natural laws of this world bowed before him. When he walked upon the sea, the water held him up. When he spoke to the storm, the winds obeyed his voice. When he blessed the loaves, they multiplied in his hands. When he called to the dead, they returned to life. No man could do such things. No prophet before him had ever walked with such authority. No king had ever commanded with such power. No teacher had ever spoken with such finality. He forgave sins, something only God himself could do. The paralytic man lowered through the roof did not just receive healing, he received forgiveness. The woman caught in adultery did not just receive mercy, she received a new beginning. The thief on the cross did not just receive words of comfort, he received paradise itself. Who else could look at a broken, sinful person and not just see their past, but rewrite their future? Who else could see through the masks of men and reveal the depths of their hearts? Who else could know every failure, every hidden sin, every secret shame, and yet still offer love that no failure could erase? The demons recognized him and trembled at his presence. They knew who he was even when men did not. They begged for mercy, for they knew their time was short. When he entered a city, darkness fled. When he laid hands on the oppressed, chains broke. No sorcerer, no religious leader, no earthly power could do what he did. His authority was not borrowed, it was not given to him by man, it was his from the beginning, unshaken, unchallenged, unmatched. And yet he humbled himself. He could have come in glory, but he chose a manger. He could have ruled from a throne, but he chose to walk among fishermen. He could have called down angels to serve him, but he knelt to wash the feet of his own disciples. He had all power, yet he laid it down for the sake of love. What kind of man does this? What kind of king exchanges his crown for a cross? What kind of ruler lays down his life for the very ones who reject him? No ordinary man, no mere teacher, no simple prophet. Even at his trial he remained silent before his accusers, not because he was weak, but because he was in control. When they mocked him, he did not answer. When they struck him, he did not resist. When they placed a crown of thorns upon his head, he did not remove it. When they nailed him to the cross, he did not call for angels to save him. Every moment, every wound, every drop of blood was chosen. He did not lose his life, he gave it. He was not a victim, he was the sacrifice. But death could not hold him. The grave could not keep him. The stone was rolled away, not so he could escape, but so the world could see that he was already gone. The same voice that called Lazarus out of the tomb now declared victory over death itself. The same hands that healed the sick now bore the marks of redemption. The same power that spoke the universe into existence now shattered the chains of sin and the curse of the grave. The world has tried to explain him away. They have called him a myth, a legend, a good man with a tragic ending. They have tried to reduce him to a philosophy, an idea, a moral teacher. But he is none of these things. He is not just a figure of history, he is the author. of history. He is not just a voice from the past, he is the voice that still calls today. He is not just a man, he is more than a man. Every empire that has risen has fallen. Every ruler that has ruled has faded into history. Every kingdom that has been built has crumbled. But his name remains. His influence has not diminished. His kingdom has not been shaken. Kings have tried to silence him. Governments have tried to outlaw him. Skeptics have tried to erase him, but he remains. His words are still alive. His power is still at work. His presence is still calling. If he were just a man, he would have been forgotten. If he were just a teacher, his words would have faded. If he were just a prophet, his tomb would still be full. But he is more. He is the one who was, who is, and who is to come. From the moment he stepped onto the scene, there was something different about him. He did not speak like the teachers of the law, nor did he walk in the traditions of men. He did not seek the approval of the religious leaders, nor did he fear the power of earthly rulers. He carried himself with an authority that no one had ever seen before. An authority that could not be explained, contained, or denied. It was not the authority of position, for he had no earthly title. It was not the authority of wealth, for he had no riches. It was not the authority of force, for he did not command an army. Yet when he spoke, the winds obeyed. When he commanded, demons trembled. When he reached out his hand, sickness fled. His authority was not of this world, because he was not of this world. The people marveled at him because he did not teach like the scribes. They quoted traditions, but he declared truth. They spoke of what they had learned, but he spoke as the source of all wisdom. When he stood in the synagogue and read from the scroll of Isaiah, he did not simply interpret the words, he fulfilled them. When he spoke of the law, he did not simply explain it, he revealed its true purpose. And when he preached about the kingdom, he did not describe it as a distant hope. He declared that it was here, now, in him. Everywhere he went, his authority was undeniable. One day, as he and his disciples crossed the sea, a furious storm arose. The waves crashed against the boat, the wind howled, and the disciples feared for their lives. But he slept. He was not disturbed by the chaos around him because he was greater than the storm. When they woke him in fear, he rose and simply spoke, "Peace, be still." At once the winds ceased, the waves calmed, and the sea was still. The disciples were left in awe, asking themselves, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They had seen miracles before, but this was something different. This was not a man asking God to act. This was a man commanding creation itself. His authority extended beyond the natural world. It reached into the spiritual realm as well. In the presence of religious leaders, the demons remained silent. In the presence of earthly kings, they stayed hidden. But when he walked into a town, they could not help but cry out. They knew who he was before the people did. They shrieked in terror, begging him not to destroy them. With a single word, he cast them out. No rituals, no incantations, no struggle, just a command. They had no choice but to obey. When he stepped into the region of the Gadarenes, he was met by a man possessed by a legion of demons. No one could control him. Chains could not bind him. The people feared him, but the demons feared something greater. "What have you to do with us?" they cried. They knew they had no power in his presence. With one command, he sent them fleeing into a herd of pigs, and the man who had been tormented for years was instantly set free. The town had tried everything to change him, but it took only a moment in his presence to transform him completely. He demonstrated authority over sickness, not by offering remedies or prescriptions, but by speaking and touching with divine power. A man covered with leprosy approached him, desperate but uncertain. He had heard the stories. He had seen others healed. But this disease was different. No one touched a leper. No one dared come close. But he reached out his hand and touched the man before saying a word. Then, with a simple statement, "Be clean," the disease vanished. No process, no delay, just instant healing. A blind man received sight. A crippled man stood and walked. A woman suffering for 12 years was healed simply by touching the hem of his garment. No physician had been able to help her. No treatment had worked. But one moment in his presence did what years of suffering could not undo. His authority was not bound by time, space, or even death itself. When news came that Jairus' daughter had died, the people said it was too late. But he walked into that house, past the mourners, past the doubt, past the finality of death itself. He took her by the hand and said, "Little girl, arise." And she did. Life returned to her body, breath filled her lungs. What was impossible for man was nothing for him. And if there was any doubt about the extent of his power, it was erased when he stood before the tomb of Lazarus. For 4 days death had done its work. The body had begun to decay. The grave had claimed its victory. The mourners had accepted their loss. But he was not bound by the rules of this world. He did not ask for permission from death. He did not plead for a miracle. He simply called out, "Lazarus, come forth." And the dead man walked out, not a ghost, not a vision, but a living, breathing man, restored completely. His authority extended beyond the physical and spiritual. It reached into the very heart of the human condition. He did not just heal bodies, he healed souls. He did not just cast out demons, he set people free. He did not just speak words, he spoke life. When a sinful woman knelt before him, weeping at his feet, he did not condemn her. He did not turn her away. He did not demand payment for forgiveness. Instead, he looked at her and said, "Your sins are forgiven." The religious leaders were outraged. "Who is this who even forgives sins?" they asked. They knew what this meant. No man had the right to do such a thing. Only God himself could forgive sin. But there he was, declaring freedom with the authority of the one who had the power to give it. Even his enemies recognized his authority. The Pharisees sent men to arrest him, but they returned empty-handed, saying, "No one ever spoke like this man." Pilate, the Roman governor, stood before him, questioning him, trying to understand. "Do you not know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" Pilate said. But he answered, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above." Even as he stood in chains, he was in control. When he was nailed to the cross, the earth itself responded. Darkness covered the land. The ground shook. The temple veil was torn in two. The Roman centurion who had overseen countless executions looked at him and declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." And when he breathed his last, it was not a defeat. It was a declaration. "It is finished," he said, not in surrender, but in victory. And 3 days later, he proved that his authority had no limits. The tomb was empty. The stone was rolled away, not so he could leave, but so the world could see that he had already gone. The grave could not hold him. Death could not claim him. Hell could not keep him. He walked out in glory, in power, in triumph, declaring once and for all that he alone holds the keys to life and death. His authority was not just for that time, it remains today. His words have not lost their power. His presence has not faded. His dominion has not weakened. The same voice that calmed the storm still speaks peace. The same hand that healed the sick still reaches out. The same power that raised the dead still brings life. The question is not whether he has authority, the question is whether we recognize it. From the beginning, his love was different. It was not the kind of love that the world knew, not the kind that was given only when it was deserved, not the kind that changed when circumstances shifted. His love was constant, unshaken, unbreakable. It was a love that did not wait to be loved first. It was a love that pursued, that reached, that gave without expecting anything in return. It was a love that saw the worst in people and still chose them, still embraced them, still welcomed them with open arms. It was the kind of love that could not be measured, could not be contained, and could not be explained by human reasoning. It was the love of heaven itself, walking in human form. He did not love as the world loved. The world loved based on conditions, based on worth, based on appearances. But he loved the unworthy, the forgotten, the broken. When others walked past the outcast, he walked toward them. When others avoided the sinner, he sat at their table. When others rejected the unclean, he touched them with healing hands. He saw the ones the world refused to see. He heard the cries that others ignored. He went where no one else was willing to go, because love always moves, always acts, always reaches beyond the barriers of society. There was a woman caught in the very act of adultery, dragged before him by religious leaders who demanded justice. According to the law, she deserved to die. According to tradition, she had no hope. The crowd stood ready to condemn, ready to stone her, ready to prove their righteousness by taking her life. But he saw beyond her sin. He saw beyond her failure. He saw beyond the shame that had wrapped itself around her like a heavy chain. Instead of joining in their condemnation, he knelt down and wrote in the dust. The accusers pressed him for an answer, and he stood and said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one they walked away because they knew that none of them were worthy to judge. When all had left, he looked at her and said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." His love did not ignore sin, but it did what no law could do. It restored her. He saw a tax collector sitting at his booth, a man hated by his own people, a man viewed as a traitor and a thief. No one would have chosen him, no one would have welcomed him. But he walked up to that man and simply said, "Follow me." And in that moment, love changed everything. The tax collector left behind his old life and followed him. The love he had encountered was greater than all the riches he had gained. He had spent years taking from others, but now he was ready to give, to restore, to walk in the newness of a love that had given him a second chance. A leper, covered in disease, cast out from society, approached him one day. Others would have run the other way. Others would have thrown stones to keep him at a distance. But he came, kneeling, pleading, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." There was no doubt in his mind that he had the power to heal. The only question was whether he would care enough to do it. Without hesitation, he reached out his hand and touched him. It was more than just healing. It was love in action. The leper had likely not felt the warmth of human touch in years, had likely lived in isolation, forgotten, abandoned. But in that moment, he was not just cleansed, he was seen, he was valued, he was loved. A woman who had suffered for 12 years, who had spent all she had seeking a cure, who had been labeled unclean and forced to live in the shadows, heard that he was passing through. She had no right to approach him. She had no right to even be in the crowd. But she pushed through anyway, desperate, believing that if she could just touch the edge of his garment, she would be healed. And as she reached out, power flowed, and instantly she was made whole. He stopped, turned, and asked, "Who touched me?" The disciples were confused. There were so many people pressing around him. How could he ask such a question? But he knew that someone had reached out in faith. Trembling, she came forward and fell before him. He did not rebuke her. He did not shame her. He looked at her with love and said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." She was not just healed. She was acknowledged, accepted, embraced. She was called daughter. A word of belonging, a word of restoration, a word that spoke louder than all the years of rejection she had endured. He was love in every moment, in every encounter, in every word he spoke. He loved the children, the ones society often overlooked. When others saw them as a distraction, he welcomed them, held them, blessed them. He loved the poor, the broken, the weary. When others avoided them, he met them in their need, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, restoring the lost. He loved his friends deeply. When their brother Lazarus died, he wept with them. He knew he would raise him from the dead. But still, he wept because love enters into sorrow. Love feels the pain of others. Love walks alongside those who grieve. Even his enemies could not stop his love. When he was betrayed, he did not retaliate. When he was falsely accused, he remained silent. When he was mocked and beaten, he did not fight back. As they drove nails into his hands and lifted him up on a cross, he looked at those who had put him there and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." In the moment of his greatest suffering, he did not curse his tormentors. He interceded for them. When one of the thieves crucified beside him cried out for mercy, he did not turn him away. He did not remind him of his crimes, did not condemn him for a lifetime of sin. Instead, he said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." His love was not weak, it was not passive, it was fierce, relentless, unstoppable. It was a love that pursued the lost, that rescued the sinner, that endured the cross. It was a love that went beyond words, beyond gestures, beyond anything the world had ever known. It was a love that gave everything, holding nothing back. It was a love that paid the highest price, that took the punishment of sin, that bore the weight of humanity's rebellion, all so that we could be free. And when he rose again, that love remained. It was not buried in the tomb. It was not defeated by death. It was alive, victorious, unchanging. The same love that had walked among the people, that had healed, restored, and forgiven, was still reaching, still calling, still transforming lives. The same love that had embraced the broken still embraces today. The same love that had spoken peace to the fearful still speaks peace now. The same love that had given hope to the hopeless still offers hope to all who will receive it. His love was perfect because it was not based on what we deserved. It was perfect because it was given freely. It was perfect because it was not just something he did, it was who he was. Every word he spoke, every step he took, every act of compassion, every moment of mercy, every sacrifice was the embodiment of a love so deep, so wide, so unfathomable that nothing in heaven or on earth could compare. A love that reached beyond time, beyond failure, beyond sin, beyond death itself. A love that remains, a love that calls, a love that waits with open arms. From the very beginning, death had ruled over mankind. It had been the great equalizer, the final word, the inescapable end that no one could avoid. Kings and servants, rich and poor, righteous and wicked, all fell before its power. No matter how strong a man was, no matter how wise, no matter how wealthy, the grave always won. It swallowed up generations, silenced voices, and turned men's greatest achievements into dust. It was the shadow that loomed over every life, the chain that bound every soul. And yet there was one who came to break the power of death, one who would not be conquered by the grave, but who would instead conquer it once and for all. From the moment he stepped onto the earth, death knew that its reign was threatened. Wherever he went, life followed. Sickness fled at his word. Blind eyes opened. Deaf ears were made to hear. The lame leaped with joy. He walked among the broken and their bodies were restored. But it was more than just physical healing. He carried the authority to undo the curse that had plagued humanity since the beginning. The curse of sin, the curse of separation, the curse that had made death the final sentence of every man. It was not just the sick that trembled before him, it was death itself. He approached the funeral processions of the hopeless and turned mourning into joy. In a small village, a widow walked beside the lifeless body of her only son, preparing to bury the last hope she had. But as he saw her, his heart was moved with compassion. He stepped forward, touched the bier, and spoke 3 simple words, "Young man, arise." And at once life returned. The boy sat up, and his mother's sorrow turned to joy. The people marveled and asked themselves, "Who is this, that even death obeys him?" Yet death had not seen its greatest defeat. Not yet. One of his closest friends, Lazarus, lay in a tomb for 4 days. The mourners had already gathered. The sisters had already wept. The grave had already claimed its prize. But he was not disturbed by the stench of decay, not intimidated by the finality of the moment. He stood before that sealed tomb, the stone rolled across its entrance, and commanded, Take away the stone." And when the objections came, when the doubts were spoken, he simply lifted his eyes and prayed. Then, with a voice that echoed through eternity, he called out, "Lazarus, come forth!" And at that moment, the impossible happened. The man who had been dead walked out, still wrapped in grave clothes, still marked by the evidence of death's grip, but undeniably alive. The crowd was speechless. Some fell to their knees in awe. Others ran to tell what they had seen. But the rulers of the time were afraid because they knew this was not just a miracle. This was a declaration that death had met its match. But the final battle had yet to come. The moment he had spoken of from the beginning was approaching. He had told his followers again and again that he would be handed over, that he would suffer, that he would be put to death. But they did not understand. They could not imagine a world in which he could be defeated. Yet the day came when the weight of the world's sin was placed upon him. He was betrayed by one of his own, abandoned by his closest friends, falsely accused, mocked, beaten, and condemned. He carried the instrument of his execution up a hill where criminals were crucified, where the guilty met their end, and as they drove nails into his hands and feet, as they lifted him up for all to see, death itself looked upon him and believed it had won. For hours he hung there, bearing the weight of every sin, every failure, every curse that had ever held mankind in bondage. The sky grew dark, the earth trembled, the veil in the temple was torn in two, and with his final breath he declared, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. The world seemed to stand still. His followers were devastated. The one they had placed their hope in was gone. His body was taken down, wrapped in linen, and laid in a borrowed tomb. A heavy stone was rolled into place. Roman guards were stationed outside to ensure that no one would steal the body. The rulers of the time believed they had silenced him, that they had ended the threat he posed. But the grave was never meant to hold him. The stone was never meant to keep him in. The guards were never strong enough to prevent what was coming, because on the third day, before the morning light had fully broken through, something began to happen. The ground shook. The heavens bore witness. The stone that had sealed the tomb was rolled away, not by human hands, but by the power of heaven itself. And he stepped out, not as a broken man, barely clinging to life, not as a wounded figure in need of help, but as the victorious king who had conquered death. When the women came to the tomb, they expected to find a body. They came in sorrow, prepared to anoint the dead. But they found the stone rolled away, and inside, the place where he had been laid was empty. Two angels stood before them and declared, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen." Fear and wonder gripped them. They ran to tell the others. Some doubted, some could not believe it. But then he appeared, first to Mary in the garden, then to the disciples, then to hundreds at once. He showed them his hands, his side. He walked with them, ate with them, spoke with them. Death had done its worst, but he had overcome. The grave had tried to hold him, but it had failed. The enemy had thought it had won, but in reality, it had lost everything. And because he conquered death, everything changed. Death no longer had the final word. The grave was no longer the end. Sin no longer had the power to condemn. The curse that had plagued humanity since the beginning was broken. He had not just risen for himself, he had risen for all who would believe. The power that brought him out of the tomb was the same power that now offered new life to every soul that would come to him. From that moment forward, death was no longer a master, it was a defeated enemy. The fear of the grave was shattered. The chains that had bound humanity were broken, and the promise was given that all who put their trust in him would share in his victory. "I am the resurrection and the life," he had said. "Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live." And his resurrection was the proof that his promise was true. Even his enemies could not deny it. The religious leaders who had sought to destroy him could not explain the empty tomb. The soldiers who had guarded it could not account for what had happened. The rulers of the world could not silence the testimonies of those who had seen him alive. The movement they had tried to crush only grew stronger, because those who had once feared death now walked in boldness, knowing that the one they followed had already overcome it. And his victory was not just for that time, it remains today. The power that raised him from the dead still transforms lives. The same voice that called Lazarus from the grave still calls hearts out of darkness. The same authority that broke the chains of death still sets the captives free. No grave is too deep, no sin is too great, no soul is too lost, because he has already won the battle. Where then is death's victory? Where is its sting? It has been swallowed up in triumph. He holds the keys to death and the grave. He reigns forever, not as a fallen leader remembered only in history, but as the risen King who will never be defeated. The one who was dead is alive forevermore, and because he lives, all who trust in him will live as well. There is no neutrality with him. There is no standing on the sidelines, no avoiding the question. Every person who encounters him must decide. He does not leave room for passive acknowledgement or casual agreement. He demands a response, not out of pride, not out of arrogance, but because of who he is. When he spoke, people were amazed not just at the authority of his words, but at the weight they carried. He did not come merely to inspire or to teach moral lessons. He did not come to offer another philosophy or to be remembered as a good man. He came to call people to a decision, and every person who heard him knew that they could not walk away unchanged. Some tried to ignore him, but they could not. His presence disrupted the world around him. The religious leaders, the scholars, the rulers of the time, they wanted to pretend he was just another teacher, just another man stirring up the crowds. But they knew his words held power. They knew his actions had authority. They knew that he was not like the others. That is why they opposed him, why they tried to silence him. Because to accept him meant everything had to change. To accept him meant surrender. To accept him meant acknowledging that he was exactly who he claimed to be. Others followed him for a time, drawn by his miracles, fascinated by his wisdom. They saw him heal the sick, cast out demons, raise the dead. They ate the bread he multiplied, marveled at his ability to command the storms. But when he spoke of deeper things, when he called them beyond the surface, many turned away. It was easy to follow him when he was performing wonders. It was easy to be near him when he was feeding thousands. But when he said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny himself, take up his cross and follow me," many could not accept it. When he declared, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you," many found it too hard to understand, and one by one they left. Because to follow him was not just to receive his blessings, it was to surrender, to give up control, to trust him completely. Some believed but stayed silent. Nicodemus, a teacher of the law, came to him at night, searching for truth but afraid of what others might say. He listened, he learned, he recognized that he was not just another rabbi, but he hesitated. For a time he remained in the shadows, torn between what he knew to be true and what it would cost him to admit it. And he was not alone. There were others, leaders, rulers, men and women who saw the truth, yet feared the consequences of declaring it. Because to stand with him meant risking everything. It meant rejection. It meant losing status, losing comfort, losing reputation. And so they waited, watching from a distance, afraid to choose. But there were those who knew they could not ignore him, those who, when faced with the decision, chose to follow no matter the cost. The fishermen who left their nets, their businesses, their families, and followed him without hesitation. The tax collector who abandoned his wealth, his career, his old ways to walk with him. The woman who broke an expensive jar of perfume and poured it on his feet, an act of worship so extravagant that even the disciples questioned her. The blind beggar who refused to be silenced, crying out, "Son of David, have mercy on me," until he stopped and healed him. the woman who had suffered for 12 years but pushed through the crowd just to touch the edge of his garment, the thief on the cross who, in his final moments, recognized the truth and called out, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." They knew, they understood, and they responded. But there were also those who rejected him completely. The rich young ruler who walked away sorrowful because he loved his possessions more than the truth. The religious leaders who, despite seeing his miracles, plotted against him because his presence threatened their power. The crowds who once shouted Hosanna but later cried crucify him because he was not the kind of king they expected. Judas, who had walked with him, seen his wonders, heard his words, yet chose to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. And the response he demanded was not just for those in his time, it is for every person in every generation. Because he did not come just to be admired, just to be studied, just to be respected from a distance. He came to call people to a decision. He asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Not just who the crowd said, not just what the rumors claimed, but who they believed him to be. And that question remains for every person today. Who do you say that he is?